Now, speaking of economics, that leads us into our next story. And this is Richard Wolff and the banking crisis. Now, Richard Wolff interviewed Yanis. I haven't actually heard from him in a while in reference to interviews. But Yanis Varoufakis, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. You might recognize his face. But they're going to talk a little bit here about this banking crisis, where it actually is coming from, the current one that we have right now, and how this all leads into capitalism. These two stories are connected. We have to start paying attention, guys.
Hear your thinking about it. Let's start with what is very much shaking this side of the Atlantic, and maybe also your side, the so-called banking crisis that we are in. That was precipitated, even though it's been building for a while, it was precipitated by the collapse of the Silicon Valley Bank in California, the Signature Bank in New York, perhaps also Credit Suisse in Switzerland. And you have made a remark that I thought would be a good place to start. Your comment, at least as you are quoted, quote, "Let the banks burn." Tell us a little bit what you think is going on and what that quotation means.
Go ahead and hit that like button, guys, if you haven't had a chance to do so. Think about what he just said. Let the banks burn. Think about that.
Let me preface my comments with the strong conviction that this is not a new banking crisis. This is exactly the same banking crisis that we experienced in 2007, 2008. It never went away.
Boom. This is the point that I really want to stress. So when we were talking about the Silicon Valley Bank crisis and Signature Bank, and then I think we also talked about First Republic as well on the show, there were numerous financial experts that you saw on mainstream media say, this is nothing like '08. We're not headed in that direction. No, you don't need to be worried. You don't need to be concerned. And I told you that I feel like this is still a part of the same issue. I didn't feel like this was necessarily a separate thing. That's why I kept saying I'm getting '08 vibes, like that kind of thing. So Yanis here is letting you know this is coming from the same banking crisis that we had in '08. It never really went away. And if it never really went away, this is all starting to make more sense. Because one of the things that I noticed is that even a couple of years later after the banking crisis, the economy started to pick up again. But to me, financially, it never felt the way it did before the '08 housing crisis again. At least not for me. I don't know about you guys. And I think I'm right about that. So what we have here, we're talking 10 plus years down the road, and we are still having issues from that '08 banking crisis. And that was the subprime mortgage rates. You guys know about that whole story. But when you have a situation where you have banks that were stealing people's homes, particularly elderly Black people's homes, these homes were foreclosed. Then you had companies like BlackRock buying those foreclosed properties, renovating those homes, and then selling them at a higher price. This is part of the reason why it is very difficult for younger people today to buy a single family home. Yes, there are other factors that go along with this. Student debt is a big part of it. But you have to understand, when people tell you we have a housing shortage, there was no housing shortage. We don't have a shortage of homes. What we have are homes that people can't afford to buy. And that goes back to BlackRock buying up those foreclosed properties. And that goes back to those banks stealing those homes from people, elderly people, particularly elderly Black people, who some of them had already almost paid off the homes. It all goes back to '08, in my opinion. So this is very important for people to understand. So when someone tells you, because people keep saying this, someone tells you there's a housing shortage, there is no housing shortage. What there is are homes that people just can't afford to buy, thanks to companies like BlackRock and thanks to those banks. Let's go on.
It's not that it was fixed and now it's coming back. The crisis of Wall Street, of the smaller banks, of the shadow banking system, both in the United States and across the European Union and in the United Kingdom, that crisis never went away. All that happened was that sometime at the beginning of 2009, once the Obama administration had been sworn in, and the G7 leaders and central bankers gathered in London under the aegis of a certain Mr. Gordon Brown, the then Labour Prime Minister, they decided essentially to print more than 30 trillion US dollars in order to refloat finance without fixing its structural problems, because these problems are impossible to fix without effectively undoing the whole model of globalization that was built since the early 1990s. So it's a bit like what they did in 2009 was a little like administering very large doses of cortisone into a cancer patient. The tumor doesn't go away. The patient seems perkier, seems to be doing better. Crisis has not gone away. Indeed, I love to say that
I think his audio breaks up a little bit here. We have to scoot to another part anyway. But the point that he's trying to drive home there is that this crisis, it did not go away. And that explains why people have been struggling for so long. Now we're going to go to part 2, because they take a break and then they come back, where they talk about the issue with capitalism. So let's listen to this piece here.
Post called Global Capitalism, designed to help others understand current economic events and trends so they can explain the impact and effects capitalism creates across the globe to others. Global Capitalism is available on our website, democracyatwork.info. There you can also learn more about everything we produce. Sign up for our mailing list, follow us on social media, and support the work we do. Please stay with us. We will.
Sorry. Here we go.
Empire is declining, and with it, its capitalist center. So let me turn it over to you again, Yanis. What do you think?
Well, in one sense, the United States economic machine has been faltering and declining since the mid-60s, as you know, when the United States lost its trade surplus. And the result of that was, as we know, that Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August 1971, blew up the Bretton Woods system that the United States had created. Why? Because America was no longer capable, due to it being a deficit country, to maintain the global dollar-based system that it had created after 1944. So in a sense, there's been a decline. Rick, back in 1970, when...
So I just want to point this out, because a lot of people say, well, there was a recession in the 1970s, and maybe that's actually why, when it really started. But Yanis is saying it actually goes back to the 1960s. Now, I wasn't alive then, and I know some of you watching were not either. But maybe we could speak to our parents or our grandparents about that.
Henry Kissinger was not even in the State Department. He had put a question to his entourage. And the question was very similar to yours. Now that we're declining as an economic power, how can we maintain our hegemony? And the answer that was given to him by a young man back then, youngish man, Paul Volcker, you remember him, right? When he was acting as an advisor to Henry Kissinger at the National Security Agency, Council. So it's really very simple. We have to make sure that we maintain our hegemony by making other people pay for it, which is the model after the 1970s, which Paul Volcker also helped establish once he had moved to the Fed. Essentially, if you think about it, it's quite remarkable.
They maintain that hegemony by making other people pay for it. And who were the other people? Think about that. That decision was made in 1970s, and we've been dealing with it ever since.
American empire is the first empire in human history that has managed to make the wealthy of the rest of the world, of the conquered, if you want, voluntarily to send their wealth to Wall Street, and therefore to close the loop, the recycling loop, whereby the American trade deficit operates as a vacuum cleaner, sucking into the American markets the net exports of everybody else, Germany, France, Italy, and of course Japan, and primarily China. With 70% of the profits of the Japanese, the Italians, the French, the Japanese, and the Chinese going back into real estate, into the stock exchange, and into the insurance businesses of the United States. So, to cut a long answer short, the center of the American empire is shrinking in terms of GDP, of total income, in terms of total investment, in terms of the jobs that it can create, good quality jobs within the United States. All this is in decline. But the hegemony of the United States does not depend on that. There is a disconnect between the real economy of the United States and the power of the rentier class, the rentier American ruling class.
I want to comment on the real estate piece before he gets to the rentier class, because this is connected. The real estate piece. So when he talks about other countries, you know, investing their money in real estate, investing their money in Wall Street. Yeah, so we see this a lot on the East Coast. I can't speak for the West Coast, but on the East Coast, we do see where international investors will come in and they will purchase commercial real estate, right? Sometimes also residential as well. And they will purchase it. And I had a friend go through this. They will purchase these units, these buildings, and then they will choose to renovate the buildings, which means the people in the buildings that live there, they have to move. They have to leave, right? They'll renovate the buildings, and the people in the neighborhood are told, we are bringing more affordable housing to the neighborhood. Couple months down the road, they look across the street and they see it's a luxury condo building or a luxury apartment building. What happened to the affordable units that they were supposed to bring in? This happens often. It's happened in Boston a lot, Cambridge, Somerville, the whole area. It happens in New York. It happens in DC. Like, this is not something that's uncommon, particularly here. So now the people who can afford to rent those units, it's only people of a certain professional class that can afford to pay $3,000, $4,000 a month for an apartment. And this is how the neighborhoods will start to change. This is how gentrification will start to make its way through the neighborhoods, because now the property value of that building, where a one bedroom may have been $1,900 or $2,000 a month, which is pretty cheap for Boston, believe it or not. Now the property value increases because it's more expensive to rent in that building now. So when the property value of that building increases, then that puts pressure on the buildings that are next to it to also increase the property value. Then the next thing you know, you get another international investor who will come in to the landlord in the building next to that one and say, sell me the building. Don't worry, I'll keep it in the community. We'll keep it the same. It does not happen. And people, one by one, they're pushed out. So this is a big problem, but I want to add to what Yanis is saying. It's not just international investors in reference to real estate. It's also companies right here in the USA, like BlackRock and Vanguard, that buy up these buildings and renovate them and make them pretty much unaffordable to the working class people who grew up in those neighborhoods. This is why I continue to say, and I will continue to say this, there is no housing shortage. You just have housing that the average working class American, particularly here on the East Coast, can no longer afford. That's what you have. Now, he's going to get into this piece here about the rentier class. This piece is important.
What that power hinges on, since it doesn't hinge on industry, on actual income, is on the capacity to maintain the hegemony of the dollar and the dollar payment system, so as to ensure that the surplus value produced in China, in Japan, in Germany, and so on, ends up in the United States, not with the American people, of course, right? You know this better than anyone else. Not with the working class in the Midwest, but with the very, very few amongst the American regime.
There you go.
All right. I want to turn next to your own activism. Something is going on in Europe having to do with the extraordinary movement of the French people into the streets against Macron, having to do even with the trade unions in the transport sector in Germany, having to do with the Greeks in response to the railway catastrophe and the role of the government. I want your opinion. Here in the United States, we're speaking of a rise of labor militancy on a scale we haven't seen for 70 years. Is something comparable going on in Europe?
I have good news and I have bad news. I'll start with the good news. The good news is that, yes, in France and in Greece, in other countries as well, but primarily in these two countries, there's a tradition of them to this. The French had their revolution, and then a few years later, the Greeks had their revolution, both connected to the American Revolution, but that's going a long way back. Both in France and in Greece, there is clearly a tidal switch. The tide of neoliberalism and the success of toxic radical centrism have been reversed by the people out there. In Greece, you are right, we had a massive accident killing 57 young people. And this railway accident, it wasn't an accident. It was almost predetermined as a result of the botched privatization of our railways. That has turned the tide, and now we have a majority of the people out there who are against privatizations, and they are clearly expressing a view in favor of renationalization. That is a big.
And the Railroad Workers Union here in the United States, really, that's another thing that they're pushing too, is to nationalize the railroad. So notice that he said there that in Greece and in France, we've been covering the protests in France for quite a while, actually, that the people had a shift. Instead of the focus more so being support the neoliberalism model, there was this shift to let's support the radical model. So now that's why you have millions of people out in the streets protesting in France. So now the majority of the people are wanting to embrace radicalism, or are embracing the more what's considered radical option over the neoliberal option. And I think that is especially key if you want to have a massive class movement in this country. As long as people, the majority, still embrace the neoliberal model, we're never going to get anywhere in reference to making these demands, which means you would need at least 5% of the American population. That's all I'm asking for, to embrace that radical model to get substantial change. 5%. You don't need 80%. You don't need 90%. You just need 5% of the people in this country to want to flip and embrace that radical model. Now, what does that mean? That means that those 5% of Americans at some point will have to lose hope and faith in the electoral process. This is why I talk about the DNC fraud lawsuit. This is why I talk about how people have been given their money, given their last to these candidates and got nothing in return. This is why I continue to talk about it, because until you get to the point where you say that is it, I do not trust the electoral process in this country, it is going to be very difficult to get some type of radical class movement in this country. Because at the end of the day, you cannot have both. And I want to be very clear when I say this. You cannot have both. Let me explain to you why. One of the reasons why the civil rights movement was so successful is because they did not have both. The people focused on the activism for the civil rights movement were not trying to run for office. The people focused on the activism for the civil rights movement were not outside saying, donate money to such and such candidate. They were focused particularly on the movement and the cause. Here is what happens when you try to do both. 9 times out of 10, the neoliberal side, what he's referring to, wins out over the radical side because that's easier to do. It's easier just to donate money. It's easier just to go to the booth and vote. It's much more difficult to do the radical process, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. That's why I tell you, you can't do both at once. So what does that mean? That means that if we got 5% of the American people to embrace the more radical side of we are going to protest such and such day after day after day after day until we get these demands met, like the people in France, that is one way to go about having a significant class movement in this country. They're not going to just give it to you. They're not just going to give you a $15 minimum wage just because they think you've been suffering long enough. If that was the case, you would have had it years ago. They're not just going to give you health care just because they're like, oh, all these people are sick and dying. Maybe we should give everybody health care now. That's not how it works. You have to demand it. And that's what people in France understand. And that's what a lot of Americans do not understand. A lot of Americans think they can just get this shit done by going to the booth and voting for someone. If that were the case, so many working class people and poor people in this country would not be without. It is not the case. And that is why you don't have the things that you should have. Necessary benefits just for as being a citizen in this fucking country. That's why. You tell yourself that you deserve it. They don't think that you do. Let's go back in.
Similarly, in France, Macron's reign has been punctured. Now he's a lame duck. He will continue as a lame duck because the demonstrators, the very brave demonstrators, seized the opportunity of railing against Macron's pension reforms. By the way, the conventional media, the systemic media, present that reform as being moderate. And it sounds moderate because what did Macron do? He pushed the age limit when you go from a wage to a pension from 62 to 64. It sounds pretty moderate. Well, it is not. Once you take into consideration the fact that the average poor Frenchman lives 10 years less than the average French male rich person.
10 years less. And you can have these statistics in the US too. I told you in Boston, if you're in Roxbury and you cross the street to the South End, there's a part in Boston where Roxbury and the South End intersect. It's like Mass Ave. And if you're in the South End and you walk across the street to Roxbury at that intersection, your life expectancy drops by 30 years. That's insane. But it happens. This is what happens when you don't have the resources.
So that means that by elevating you deny a very substantial proportion of working class men the opportunity to get any pension at all. So this is the good news. The good news is that our peoples here in Europe, especially in Greece and France, but in other countries too, have turned the tide, which was essentially submerging all opposition to the neoliberal, toxic, pro-oligarchic policies across Europe. Now, the bad news. The bad news is that we are nowhere near having returned to the height of 2014, 2015, when we had hundreds of thousands of millions of people in Spanish cities occupying the piazzas. Remember the indignados? We had millions here in Greece over a period of 3 months. We had the Blockupy movement in Germany. Back then, the structural crisis of European capitalism was so deep. The euro itself, our currency, our single currency, was very close to capitulating, to falling victim of its own hubris. And what happened was that we elected the government here in Greece, which carried the hopes of every progressive European on its back. Our government surrendered on that fateful evening of the 5th of July 2015. Since then, Rick, our movements are just a shadow of themselves. They are picking up again, but we must not exaggerate yet the extent to which they are capable of putting an effective brake, a final brake on this runaway train of neoliberal inhumanity.
So what Yanis is saying there is that even though you see those protests in France and the people rising up in Greece, he said compared to 2014 to 2015, this is the bad news that he gave, it's still nowhere near what they had then, which means at some point, people have started to break. And that can happen, right? People just get tired. Sometimes people get tired of protesting. I'm just being honest. And that seems to have happened. And also, on top of that, you still have the effects of this war in Ukraine and the inflation and people in Europe dealing with that to go along with it. So it's almost like a double whammy. So there's good news there and there's bad news there. But despite all that, they're still able to get millions of people out in the streets. And I think we need to pay very close attention to what's happening with the banking crisis, because I think this is going to be very telling. We need to pay attention to the banking crisis, and we need to pay attention to what's happening with BRICS, moving away from the US dollar. This summer is going to be hot. Okay. This summer is going to be a hot summer, because I believe that's when they're supposed to have that conference to make that happen. So we'll just have to continue to follow that. We go to some of the comments here. Springflower says JP Morgan is buying up these banks as the CEO tells the government they should take our land for these 15-minute cities. Modern day concentration camps and solar built off the backs of enslaved children. I hear you. Esquerdista says Varoufakis. I always want to say Varoufakis for some reason. Varoufakis got beaten up recently by some thug outside a restaurant in Athens. Oh, wow. I didn't know about that. And thank you for the super chat, Mary. You have to get mad to make stuff happen. That's right. That's right, man.